Hello APLers. This video is meant to introduce you to a brand new Co-dfns compiler interface that will be released in the next release. I plan for the December release of the compiler just in time for you to enjoy Co-dfns over the Christmas holidays. And the interface has some new features that I think everybody's going to like. So let's get into that. Before we get into the interface itself, we should make note that the system requirements have not really changed. In particular, you will still need Dialog 16, 64-bit Unicode edition. You will still need your operating system host compiler, GCC on Linux, Clang on Mac, which you can get through the Apple developer tools. And on Windows, I recommend Visual Studio 2017 or greater. However, 2015 will work. However, I just generally recommend that you run the latest version. You will need to get ArrayFire 3.5.1 or greater. You can find a download link to ArrayFire on the releases page, or you can go to arrayfire.com to get the latest release directly from ArrayFire. And if you intend to run the Co-dfns compiler with the NVIDIA GPUs using the CUDA backend, you will need to install CUDA 8 or greater on your machine so that the compiler can find the appropriate libraries. Now, once that's all installed, if you will recall the traditional method, you will have a workspace with Co-dfns in it, and you'll have a Co-dfns namespace here, and you'll have a Co-dfns fix function, and it is a drop-in replacement for the quad fix function. Now this is the old interface. This is how we used to do it. This method is still supported, and if you have a use for the quad fix function, this is also quite useful. However, there are a few improvements that we've made to this. In particular, the build path is now gone. There's no build path setting in the compiler. Instead, we will use whatever your current working directory is. So this means that if you use the --cd command, you can find out where your files are stored, and that helps in terms of distribution, packaging things up, and generally makes everything a lot nicer and a lot less fragile, and you don't have to worry about setting a build path now. Additionally, the compiler on Windows will auto-detect the latest version of Visual Studio that it can find on your machine and will attempt to use that version of Visual Studio. So that means you should not need to start finding your Visual Studio path if you want to use the compiler on Windows. Instead, you should just be able to get going, no problemo. If the compiler cannot find that, it will trigger a missing Visual C++ error, and that will indicate that it could not find a compatible version of Visual Studio installed. One of the reasons this can be is if you did not install the C++ development environment for Visual Studio. Additionally, by default now, the af_delta_lib environment variable is set to the empty string. And the empty character vector indicates that the Co-dfns compiler should use the unified backend, which means that it will attempt at runtime to auto-detect whether to use the CUDA, OpenCL, or the CPU backends, and will choose the best one that it can find. CUDA to start with if it can find that, OpenCL if not, and defaulting or degrading to the CPU version if it cannot find or work with either the OpenCL or CUDA versions. The af_lib variable can now be set to either CUDA, OpenCL, or CPU. Any one of those is supported now. This is a change. We have removed the AF prefix from the variable values for this af_delta_lib variable. This is the only global variable in the Co-dfns namespace that you should have to set, and it is only necessary to set this variable if you intend to use the fix function, the old style of building a namespace. Now, this namespace has a bit of a disadvantage because you have to provide a prefix or a name for the fix to use, and you have to provide your namespace in the form of this character vector, or this nested character vector. And that can be inconvenient if you do not have a salted namespace, or for any other reason that you don't easily have a way of converting your code into this form. Now, a lot of code can be converted using quad source, but that's only if it has already been a scripted namespace. So the new interface is now an user command. So inside of the repository, as part of the distribution, the Co-dfns.dialog file is now a self-contained user command. So you can copy this command into your user commands directory, and in so doing, that will give you a Co-dfns user command group with the compile function inside of it. And this compile command will allow you to work from any namespace. So if we, for instance, just pull up the dialog interpreter without a particular workspace or without anything, we're in a clear workspace. We are not in any particular directory. Our working directory is the standard working directory of the dialog interpreter. And so we can still access the compile command from here, even though we have not loaded in the Co-dfns namespace or anything like that. And that allows us to call the compiler from inside of workspaces that do not, in such a way that we do not have to copy in the namespace in order to use it. So one of the ways that this works is the new version will work even for namespaces that cannot be sourced. So for example, we have here, we can have two namespaces, one of which is a sourced namespace and the other one is not. So with the MS namespace, we could have easily used the Co-dfns fix function on it, but it's not as obvious how to use the Co-dfns fix function on the NS namespace because we can't easily convert it into a nested character vector. Well, no matter. Now we can simply compile NS to the CDNS namespace, and we will not need to do anything special. The compiler will convert this into a namespace script as appropriate and will work just fine. So now we have these two namespaces that we can work with, and we can generate them. Now, since I did not provide a modifier to the compile command, it's going to be using the unified namespace. And if I look, this is where the files are going to be stored. So sometimes it's convenient to look at the log file for one of these files. So we can actually open up the log file for one of these compilers and get a view of the results of compilation without having to open up an Explorer window or anything like that. And this will come in convenient if you have a compiler error. For some reason you need to look at the logs. It's now very easy because the names of the files are all prefixed. The names are all the name of the namespace itself and the extension. We've simplified the naming conventions for this. Additionally, if you use the old fix function, you could get file name access errors if you tried to recompile over a namespace that was previously already used in the workspace, because the compiled namespace would already have a lock on the DLL or something like that. And this only occurred in Windows, but it was kind of annoying. So now, as part of the user command, it will take care of expunging that namespace for you before it refixes the newly compiled namespace. So you don't have to worry about that, and you can continue to recompile your namespace as often as you want without worrying about getting that file name access error. And things will just go along swimmingly. So the benefits of this is that now, after you install your prerequisites, the only thing you need to do is to install your namespace, the Co-dfns.dialog namespace, into a user command directory. And you can set your own custom user commands directory along with the default directory simply by using the settings user command. And you can look at the settings documentation to learn how to edit the cmd directory, or the command directory. But after that, there are no global variables to set. The compiler will auto-detect all of your compiler settings as necessary based on your platform, your operating system, and your version of Visual Studio that you're using, if applicable. You will be able to set a custom backend simply by providing the -af modifier, and you can set it to CUDA, OpenCL, or CPU, and that will allow you to use a very specific backend for a given namespace. And one of the other conveniences that we have now provided is that the compiler on Windows, in order to use the CUDA backend, would require that you copy in the NVVM DLL into your local directory in order to use the backend. Now, if you tell the user command explicitly using the AF equals CUDA modifier that you want to use the CUDA backend, it will find and copy over the NVVM DLL for you automatically. And so we can look at our current working directory and we'll see the CDMS and the CDNS files, as well as a copy of the NVVM 64310 DLL. And we don't have to copy that in ourselves now. We do not have to find it. The compiler will take care of copying that DLL into the current working directory for you to use. Now, since we are storing everything into the current local working directory, it is easy to simply package up or salt your namespace that's compiled. Your compiled namespace can be salted, and then you can distribute that namespace along with the DLLs for any for use in other computers and other platforms. So it makes it very easy to distribute the package. Simply grab the DLLs in the namespace, put them into a folder, and you're good to go. On Linux and Mac, you will need to make sure that your shared objects are within the right search path. So if you keep them in the local working directory, you will need to make sure that your LD library path has the local working directory as part of its search path. However, you can move those shared objects into one of your standard library paths if you prefer, and you can manage that separately however you want, because the namespace will attempt to locate the shared objects using any of your standard search paths. On Windows, it's recommended that you simply put the DLLs and the namespace together, load them up from the same working directory. That will keep everything in line. That's the canonical way to do it on Windows, is simply launch your application from the same directory that your DLLs are located in, and that will make everything go along a lot better. There are ways of manipulating your search paths for DLLs, and if you are one of those people that does that, you don't need my help to put those DLLs in the right place and set the appropriate settings. So again, this interface will allow you to use the compiler anywhere from any workspace, and you will easily be able to find your files because they'll be in the current working directory. You don't have to mess with any build directories or build folders. Your global variables no longer need to be set. You can use a modifier in the user command to set them, and we can now take in arbitrary namespaces as long as they're closed namespaces. All the standard compiler restrictions apply, but now that namespace does not have to come in as a nested vector of strings, and instead we can take a standard namespace that's been quad fixed or a namespace that you've already created using Co-dfns, and we will go ahead and compile that and do the conversion for you, no worries. So overall, the result should be a much easier, smoother interaction with the compiler, and we hope you guys like it. If you have any questions, if you run into problems, if you try, do please try this out and see what you think. But send any issues that you have. File an issue on GitHub, send me an email, send an email to support@dialog if you would like anything you'd like to do. I encourage everyone to try to use the user commands, and I suspect that the user command is going to be the preferred method of working and interacting with the compiler going forward, so that you do not have to maintain an explicit workspace in order to manage things. And in the future, in the GitHub repository, we may completely remove the workspace from the repository if the namespaces work better. So good luck. I hope you enjoy it. I think this is a very neat addition to the compiler, and let me know if you have any questions. Good luck and have fun with APL.